Hello. This is the second of two lectures on the presidency. A number of you, if you listened to the first lecture, may have been surprised when I sort of listed off the many powers that the president has and does not have, that I didn't mention veto power at all. This was on some level intentional. On the one hand, the veto power of the presidency in particular is considered the great check on the power of the Congress. That is, that if the Congress had passed any law that would have been really contrary to the needs or will of the nation, the president has the power to check and limit that power. On the other hand, in reality, that power is actually subsumed under a number of different things. Some people have actually argued that if a president actually has to use his veto power, he's actually a pretty weak president. That a strong president will be able to sort of influence Congress in many different ways to keep them from passing legislation that he would ultimately veto. So in other words, if legislation is passed and the president vetoes it, well, then the president really hasn't done a good enough job of sort of convincing Congress to do something differently beforehand. That doesn't mean that vetoes don't ever happen. But usually there are also ways around legislation that the president may not like. Obviously, the veto is one. Another way to sort of to get a veto done is to do something called a pocket veto, which is that the president receives legislation that's been approved by Congress and just doesn't sign it. If this happens during a time that Congress is not in session, so that, for example, that they've gone on break for the summer, because the president hasn't signed the legislation within a reasonable amount of time, it becomes basically null and void. This is what's known as a pocket veto. In addition, there's been one other thing that's happened much more recently that shows the power of the presidency and the executive branch in ways that 20 years ago really didn't exist. President George W. Bush, in particular, was known for doing what was called a signing statement, which was that he would have an elaborate ceremony in the White House lawn where he would sign a piece of legislation into law. This is not new. This happened all the time. But during his actual speech, his actual statement that he made while signing this legislation, he would from time to time basically let it be known that he would not enforce this legislation. This is in fact the other power of the executive branch, that while the Congress makes legislation, the executive power branch, through its various offices, bureaucracies, and appointments, has the power to enforce it. So that, for example, if someone were to pass a law limiting, well, let's do a current example. Recently, someone has passed laws sort of saying that we should regulate what kind of products go into our food. That can be law. But without a presidential appointment and presidential orders to the U.S. Department of Agriculture to inspect for these things, it's like the law was never written. This is the enforcement power of the executive branch, and this is why some people have argued that, in fact, the ability of presidents to appoint people is, in fact, the greatest power that the presidency has. Previous iterations of the book spent a lot of time talking about all the people that the president appoints. Your current book doesn't so much, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time focusing on it. But be aware that the president appoints all of the cabinet secretaries, but also appoints people called the executive office of the president. And these are now the people who sort of have the key positions that advise the president on a regular basis. This can be people like the Council of Economic Advisors, the Office of the Vice President, as well as personal advisors, people who the president knows and trusts. In many cases, these can be people whom the president has known for considerable time. And one of the most famous appointments was, of course, during the John F. Kennedy administration, where he appointed his brother, Bobby Kennedy, to be Attorney General of the country, and thus got him into the executive branch and made him one of his closest advisors. People would say, well, this is a little bit surprising given that Bobby Kennedy had very little experience on the national stage, but it was somebody who the president trusted and could rely on. These are often the people who get into the executive office of the president. There are, of course, lots of other political appointees as well, ranging from people who are very important, like I said, the press secretary and so on, people that you see on a regular basis, down to, second and third in command of the various departments. What's important to know about these is that they are political appointments. You don't necessarily need to know a lot to become an undersecretary of labor or an undersecretary of defense, although the defense ones tend to be very tightly guarded among the military. What you need to know is you need to know the person who is the president. These are political appointees. The benefit of using political appointees in a number of key positions is that this means that the people who have these positions have a good working relationship with the person who is now president. It means that the president has rewarded them for faithful service in the past, and it means that they are able to focus on the goals of the new administration. When a new president takes office, the new president often has new priorities, and by putting new people into all these key positions, the whole bureaucracy is able to sort of focus on the priorities that the new president sets. The cost to this method, the system of using political appointees, is fairly significant, however. What it has meant is that in many cases there is a very large and unwieldy bureaucracy, and the president doesn't necessarily know what some of the undersecretaries are doing. Your book tells the story about Brown, who was in charge of the cleanup after Katrina, and how it was discovered a little bit too late, unfortunately, that he wasn't doing a particularly good job. But because he was appointed by the president, because the president didn't have oversight over them, and because the bureaucracy was so large, it took a while for people to realize that there was a better way to do things. Some of the other costs of using political appointees as presidential advisors is that some of them may have little political experience, and thus little experience in reaching out across party lines or even across sort of geographic boundaries. If most of the president's staff comes from his or her campaign or his or her home state, they may not know much about other states or other parts of the country. Moreover, it means that the political appointees have a very specific focus and may not be able to focus on the big picture issues. If someone is very much focused on making sure that colleges are accredited, for example, they may not see how colleges are also somewhat being fed by elementary and high schools, and somehow also feed into other programs. Finally, there is the problem of the fact that such appointees have a very distinct political slant, that they are very loyal to the person who appointed them. Alexander Hamilton, more than 200 years ago, basically argued that the president's real power was found in his capacity to appoint a staff. Some have argued that this is in fact the legacy of the presidency, especially in these days now when new appointees are so very difficult to get approved. One appointee may carry on the tradition of a president for considerable time. And this is, on some levels, the lasting legacy even after 4 or 8 years of a presidential office are over.